Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. As Annie says, I'm Strategy Director at Cambridge Consultants, and we're a technology consultancy and R&D company that works on connected solutions for some of the world's largest brands. And we're part of Capgemini Invent. And I'm here today to share my thoughts about if there's an alternative funding model for 5G. And I'm going to cut to the chase. In summary, the answer is that there might be in some cases, but my opinion is that it's not straightforward. And I think before we go into that, we've all come to expect cellular networks to be always available, and yet the amount that consumers are willing to pay is declining year over year. And this is the real challenge that we in our industry face. To deliver on the promise of 5G, we need to see a massive increase in scale and complexity of networks. This means the business case is very challenging. In urban areas, we need vast amounts of capacity. In rural areas, we still struggle at times to provide basic connectivity. So my suggestion is the time has come to think differently. We can't keep doing what we've done and expect 5G to meet the needs of everyone. So what I want to start with is actually what we're seeing certainly here in the UK, where we're getting a massive amount of investment in fibre at the moment. But actually, fibre is very different to mobile. So fibre costs are dominated by civil works for both incumbent and new entrant operators. And for mobile service, obviously new entrants need access to spectrum before they can deploy a service. And we've seen regulators in some markets trying to encourage new entrants to come into the market. So this has failed in Greece and the Czech Republic, where new entrant awards didn't happen, but there's been success in Italy and Portugal. So one of the challenges we have is actually it's very difficult for alternative models to come in, for people to think about deploying a different sort of business model if they don't have access to spectrum. Whereas when we think about fiber, deployments in Europe and the US have a window of opportunity to target high density areas. They're competing on relatively equal terms with the incumbent fixed operators. They need to install ducts, they need to install fiber, but it's much the same for both models. When we think about the mobile market, already we've got MNOs are building their 5G solutions rapidly in these high density areas. Another difference is that actually many of the fixed competitors are geographically limited. They are targeting city centers, regions, but not providing fully national coverage. And that reduces the capital intensity requirements and also local competition. In most cases, or many cases, we see a single competitive operator competing with an incumbent or maybe two. But actually, I think the biggest challenge for the business case for disruptive innovation in mobile is that the incumbent operators are building incremental upgrades on their existing sites. They've already got much of the infrastructure. We all know going from 4G to 5G to a first order is bolting some new boxes onto an existing site. Incumbents have a far greater challenge. And then if we actually think about the business case, the big challenge for mobile operators is actually there's a far higher proportion of the costs are OPEX. So things like intervention funding, where perhaps governments get engaged or big investors come in and provide an infrastructure funding. They can't just provide a CapEx grant and walk away. Actually, the OPEX is massively significant. So it's not like building other infrastructure. We're seeing the fiber business is backed by people who back roads or build airports. Those sort of banks are some of the people bankrolling this. So we're starting in a very different world. And if we look at what's happened, certainly here in the UK over the last few years, where we've looked at alternative funding models in mobile, it hasn't always been successful. So the UK launched its mobile infrastructure project back in 2012, which was designed to fix mobile not spots across rural areas of the UK. Big publicity, a big launch, a plan to build 575 sites. And of those, actually only 75 were delivered during the lifetime of the project. And despite the government investment, the net value, so the overall economic benefit, was negative. We've also seen challenges here in the UK trying to move first responders from Tetra to 4G, the migration from the airwave network to the emergency services network. This has been mired in delays and overspend. The project is now forecast to be 5 years late and £3 billion overspent. And it's not just in the UK. We've had similar problems in other markets. In Australia, in 2016, the National Auditor was critical of performance. Although the programme has continued and appears to have greater success in recent times, the average cost per site from this public intervention has been around €450,000. So fixing the rural coverage gap is continuing to be very problematic. So actually, what we need to think about with the mobile network deployment is moving beyond technology. At the moment, everything we talk about is new technology. Cloud RAN, Open RAN, vRAN, they're all technical solutions. But we face a challenge that up to 40% of site costs can be rental and power consumption. And that power consumption is increasing with each generation of technology. Not necessarily the power, the power per bit, but the overall power. So 5G delivers energy efficiency, certainly per megabit, but actually when the demands are huge, it's still very difficult to reduce the power consumption of a network. The GSMA states that 20 to 40% of site OpEx is power. The challenge we see is to meet the 5G user requirements that we're all familiar with, we either need massively more cells or we need far more radio complexity in each cell, or probably a blend of the two. So actually, fiber prevalence can help us with deployment options, but it won't help us with the challenge of site rental and power consumption. But technology can help us. So virtualization is changing how we deploy our urban networks. A number of reasons for this. One of the key ones is centralization of RAN control and scheduling will actually optimize network performance. We're seeing vendors now developing and deploying AI-based solutions to optimize how cells work, not individually, but across a cohort. So RIC solutions, those sort of things will help improve performance. We're also seeing people address power consumption out of hours by adaptively powering up elements of the network and powering them down when it's quiet. We're also seeing some startups trying to develop radical solutions to our growing problems. So I think there is some hope in technology, but it's probably not enough. Actually, what we need to think about is how we can load more services onto a network, how we can follow that model of the emergency services network, bringing services onto a shared network. That will reduce the need for competing sites and actually will lower the power footprint of wireless communications overall. So for me, one of the most exciting things actually for moving funding models is actually thinking about network slicing. Then we can offer bespoke services to users who are used to their own network and potentially federate private networks with public ones, allowing roaming across providers. And I think these are the solutions that will actually help us address this big challenge that we face in our industry at the moment. I think when we talk about virtualized solutions, they will show a benefit. And I think, obviously, we can't do a talk about 5G deployment without talking about Rakuten. Rakuten is reporting large savings from its greenfield network approaches of the order of 20, 30%, maybe even 40. And actually, one of the key enablers for virtualization is this availability of fiber. In many cases, mobile operators do not have their own fiber business, or they do not have fiber where they need it. So I think there is probably an opportunity for partnerships with these alternative providers, with these fixed network operators, where mobile networks could potentially offer revenue share or become anchor tenants for these new networks. However, when we think then about how we can target reductions in energy usage or site rental, we might need some more radical solutions. And actually, some operators are actively investing in breakthrough innovation through venturing. And for me, perhaps one of the most interesting options at the moment is UK startup Stratospheric Platforms, who have designed a solution to project hundreds of cells to the ground from a powered platform in the stratosphere. I've been privileged to work on elements of the communications payload, along with many colleagues here at Cambridge Consultants. And while this might be stretching the question of alternative funding models for 5G, I think it's important to consider not only the development funding of architectures that have changed little since Marty Cooper and his team at Motorola built the first cellular system almost 50 years ago, but the funding of innovation that delivers new approaches that may help us overcome the stalemate. In the example of Stratospheric Platforms, one of their large investors is Deutsche Telekom, who are taking an active role at looking at alternative models and how they can fix this challenge of having significant costs in their network that are outside their control. So again, back to site rental and power. The other thing I think we need to think about here is the role that satellite solutions will face in delivering some 5G-like use cases. So we've seen in the past Liberty Global as an investor in O3B many years ago, and the UK government in OneWeb. We now have two of the richest people in the world looking to bring a new approach to broadband services, with each committing more than $10 billion to their respective LEO satellite networks. When we actually look at what operators are currently investing in, their venture funds are typically focused in application layer startups, focused on applications and revenue sources, rather than thinking about changing the deployment economics. At the moment, operators are generally sitting there, allowing their vendors to think about new architectures and evolution of the existing models. So the drive to think differently about how we can efficiently and effectively deliver new network solutions appears to be lacking. So for me, one of the big questions when we think about 5G networks and the architectures that we largely have today is whether some of that funding is necessary to come from a greater role in the public sector. In some societies now, connectivity is becoming as important to modern life as access to food, water, transport, or energy. And services like public transportation, energy, or water are often delivered over a single network, even if there is competition at the retail level. But we still, in most of our markets, have 3 or 4 mobile operators vying for our business. And at present, many public bodies use private networks for their own connectivity, such as first responders or control networks for critical infrastructure. But they could become anchor tenants for 5G networks, taking advantages of the new services available. And I think it's fair to say, whilst early attempts to do this, such as the UK's emergency services network, have struggled, this does not mean that the principle is not sensible. And I think rather than necessarily providing investment directly, the public sector can also de-risk network builds by committing to purchase new services from operators where that brings a benefit to citizens. It's interesting when we look at Birmingham, Britain's second city, at the moment, the WM 5G program, the West Midlands 5G program backed by the UK government, is working with mobile operators and local councils to remove barriers to planning and deployment, as well as mapping local authority assets suitable for digital infrastructure deployment. So while this won't actually help with the immediate operational cost challenge, it is going to help with planning and initial deployment, becoming more efficient, trying to actually remove some of the time constraints, some of the time blockers that we have to build new networks. And for me, I think the other parallel that I'd like to table today is thinking about how the urban Wi-Fi world has developed. So about 15 years ago, I was working at BT, at British Telecom, on urban Wi-Fi solutions. And many cities around Europe and around the world have provided infrastructure to allow their citizens to access the internet as a benefit to them. And many of those networks also support internal city users as well, helping them to streamline their operations. And if we take a step back, 5G small cells will often take a similar form factor to a Wi-Fi hotspot. And so I think there's an open question about whether cities can be convinced to offer locations for 5G sites at a rent that makes the network viable. And a bit like the single Wi-Fi network that a city can deploy, I think it's useful to then think about whether there is a model for an open neutral host network, which might be easier for public investment to invest in, to allow retail level competition, that customers of all these networks can gain access to their services. And we're already seeing solutions like that starting to happen. So BAI Communications, who won the London Underground neutral host network, are now building a neutral host network with Sunderland City Council in England's northeast, with the aim of providing connectivity and advanced services to both the city and also its residents in the northeast of England. The other challenge we face, apart from access to sites, is actually around energy. And I think we need to think about collaboration and co-investment between energy companies and mobile operators, where there is scope to bring significant value. The Utilities Technology Council highlights several possible collaboration routes, including joint ventures between utilities and telecom operators for fiber backhaul connectivity, provision of utility infrastructure for small cell sites, facilitating power supplies to base station sites, and potentially utilities providing 5G services to remote locations. Utilities already have effectively a universal service obligation. Everybody has the right to be connected to electricity. So actually, power sites can be very useful both as sites, but also as sources where there is existing power. Again, as in with other public services or utilities, there are opportunities for these power companies to become anchor customers for 5G networks, moving services from their own private data networks and possibly allowing their existing sites to be used for 5G. And finally, the evolution to smart grids is going to bring a greater need for distributed energy generation, storage, and monitoring. And I believe this creates a potential opportunity for collaboration with many cell sites already having backup batteries and sometimes generators, which could be useful assets to bring into a partnership. And then I think the final piece to bring into this equation is actually thinking about the applications that both need the network and generate sufficient value to deliver a strong revenue stream. So our early deployments are focused very much on meeting the consumer needs, and we all know consumer revenue is facing a decline. So actually, I come back to this again, I want to think about anchor customers, users that can be a tool for de-risking the deployment of new technology. And in my role at UK 5G, I have a close exposure to the £200 million invested by the UK Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport here in the UK to focus not on the development of network technologies, but on the development of applications and services that deliver an economic or a social benefit. And one of those I'm very lucky to be involved with is the Liverpool 5G Create project. This is a project that combines local stakeholders, such as the city, the local health service, and universities with private sector providers to deliver health, education, and social services over a private 5G network. One of the key aims is to allow people to remain safely independent in their own homes rather than requiring residential care. And this is an interesting model because with the existing fiber assets and site assets and power provision that the city already has available, it believes it has been able to build a private 5G network at a cost-effective and economic point to compete with services from mobile operators. I think another trial that is of interest to me is based in Bristol. It's looking specifically about how 5G can help with logistics, ensuring that traceability and tracking can be maintained across boundaries between public and private networks. This hybrid approach, where we have services roaming between public and private networks, I think is going to be a key stepping stone to truly critical services being run on private networks. So actually, if we come back to the question, is there an alternative funding model for 5G? I think we're in a really difficult place. All the investment we see in virtualization, Cloud RAN and Open RAN will help us address the technology costs of the network, but they are not the dominant costs. We need to think more about energy, and we need to think about how we can change the sites model. The sites model was effectively derived from the years where we had GSM cells with a 3, 4, 5 kilometer radius in some areas and covered thousands of users. It's really hard to map that onto a millimeter wave small cell network. So my hypothesis is that we need to think more radically about how we can move the needle, how we can change that cost base. But as we're on that journey, I think alongside such radical changes and partnerships, both between private organizations and the public sector, can bring shared resources and demand aggregation, which means we can effectively de-risk that early deployment. So, final answer to the question, is there an alternative funding model? It's nearly no, but I think there are things that we can do to help be better than we are today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was very thought-provoking, and I think One of the questions I would like to ask is about the various government-funded or supported projects in the UK. And as you outlined in your talk, there are quite a number. Do you think that they have had a big impact in terms of making alternative approaches clear? I mean, is that one of their purposes, to to allow organizations to step out of their usual operational and business boundaries?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, primarily they're focused on the application layer rather than on deployments. But I think there are, one of the main things those projects do is they bring people together and they get them talking. So for me, I think what they call the barrier busting in the West Midlands is actually, they've created routes for network planners and for council planners, whose job is often to say no, to actually find a way to collaborate and work out collectively what they can do to help move things forward. So I think there's more we can do there. Is there more that government can do to drive that? I think there is, and I think there needs to be. I think what we need to do is work out how we can move from the trials. So the West Midlands is Wolverhampton, Birmingham and Coventry. I think they're doing some really interesting things around trying to make deployment more straightforward. But operators need national solutions. Operators need to be able to replicate things. They can't develop very, very local approaches. So I think it's a start, but if I'm going to be harsh, I think there's a lot more to do.
Okay, and do you think operators in the various trials that are going on, do you think they are adjusting well, at least in the boundaries of the trials, to working within ecosystems? Because this isn't something they've ever really done before. And it must be quite a hard shift in thinking, as well as operations, to do that.
I think in areas, yes. I think we're, the panel I chaired on Tuesday, we heard from operators who were very keen to do this and get better at this. But you're right, it's a massive paradigm shift for them, that effectively they've become very retail optimized businesses, selling the same thing to everybody and incredibly efficient at doing that. The moment you get into partnerships, the moment you get into more bespoke solutions, it gets harder. So I think they're on a journey. I think from my own experience here in the UK, we're seeing the research labs and the kind of the operator technology evolution community engaging at that level, but I think it's a very long way from business as usual yet. And it's a really important point. Again, we have a habit of focusing on the technology. I've called out specifically sites and power as other issues we need to think about. There's a business model challenge and there's a business culture challenge that is also needed before you can do the partnerships. So at the moment, I'd say it's driven by the technical community. And there's work to do to pull that forward into actually being something that can be productized, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. Really insightful and interesting. Thank you very much indeed.